Greetings all. We have a wonderful panel and a compressed, distilled time to get haiku-like wisdom from them, which we'll get. We'll have questions, discussion, and time for you all to ask questions at the end. One way in which you can narrate human progress or regress over the millennia is the opportunities that technology brings forward and human society's ability need to cope with the downsides of those technologies. We had the Industrial Revolution, then we had to have child labor laws. We had smokestacks, then we need to have pollution laws. We've had recently the information superhighway of the past generation, and now we're trying to cope with all the byways of that information superhighway. We have three people who are dealing with the city management part of that trade-off, where over the last generation, we've all known about the positive aspects that big data and sensors and all the other aspects of this age, the good things they can mean for city government, from infrastructure maintenance to public safety to everything else. But cities around the world are now coping with the complications as they have with every past industrial revolution. We have three ideally positioned people, all experienced in exactly this interaction between technology, technological change, public governance, and private organization who are dealing with different aspects of this question. So we're going to hear about, we have somebody who is in the middle of one of the most challenging jobs on earth, the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. Anybody who's been to Los Angeles knows that. We have someone who represents one of the major technology companies in the world and its efforts to deal with city government. And we have a leading philosopher, I will say, I'll call you that, from who's trying to put into effect, from a European perspective, a different way to deal with the pluses and minuses of technology. So I'm going to start now. I'll introduce each of our speakers as I call them. First with Rohit Aggarwala, who's the head of urban systems at Sidewalk Labs, which you know as part of the Alphabet, previously known as Google Empire, has a background as an urban planner and as a sort of philosopher, as a, let's say, technology person than a public interest and public policy person. I'm going to start by asking you for an update on one of the projects that most people in this audience are familiar with, which is the Quayside project in Toronto, which you've been centrally involved in. Many of the tensions we're discussing have come to a head in this one project. Tell us what's happening now with Quayside and what you have learned from it.
Well, so we're very excited, we're very enthusiastic about the way our conversation with the city and the public of Toronto is going. As many of you who have been following this, and I know Dan, our CEO, spoke at City Lab last year, back in June, we submitted our MIDIP, the Master Innovation and Development Plan, to our partner, Waterfront Toronto, which represents the three levels of government there. And in part with the Waterfront Toronto Board and through an action of the City Council, there was put in place pretty much a year-long timetable for a set of public reviews that we would not run, that our various government partners would run, and a set of approvals. In fact, the first milestone is this Thursday on Halloween, where we are optimistic that we will reach an agreement on a statement of principles with Waterfront Toronto. To your question about what we've learned, I mean, we've learned a great deal. And obviously, these last 2 years that we've been working in Toronto have shown a sea change in the way the world sees technology and technology companies. And I think the biggest one that we've had to wrestle with even more than I think we had expected is something that was actually talked about at some length in the Tech and City panel just earlier during the breakouts, which is the fact that there is a vacuum right now. And therefore, the negotiation around how data is used when it's collected in the public becomes something that people, citizens, are expecting to engage with companies on, with local governments, and what we've seen, in fact, in part in reaction to our work, is, I think, a growing recognition within our partners of Toronto and the province of Ontario that there's a body of regulation that they need to start putting in place, and our overall perspective on it is that that will help. Like, we will see more and better adoption of urban technology when the rules of the road are more clearly defined.
And is there an example of something that you and your company and your partners are now willing to embrace in terms of regulation that you would not have been open to a couple of years ago?
I don't think it's something that we would not have been open to. The essence of Sidewalk Labs is actually to bring together what we often talk about, the technologist and the urbanist. And so we have a CEO and other colleagues like me who are in city government. And I think we believe in the power of city government, particularly in the power of government, to shape how the private sector acts. So I don't actually think that our willingness to embrace it has changed. I think what I've personally certainly learned is I didn't realize how important it was to enable creativity. You often hear this mantra from technology companies, well, don't strangle the baby in the cradle, don't regulate too soon. I'm not sure that's true when you're talking about data that's collected in the public realm or about city functions. I think it may be the opposite, that regulation will foster creativity.
Seleta, let me ask you now, this is Seleta Reynolds, who's the general manager of the Department of Transportation in Los Angeles. And one of the visions for improving transportation, which is one of LA's big challenges and that of other metropolises around the world, is, in a sense, the more data you can get, the better. Who is going where, when, what trips they want to make, where the log jams are, et cetera. And yet this is fundamentally in conflict with some privacy concerns of individuals, the companies that are taxi companies and the ride-sharing companies, et cetera. Tell us where LA stands right now on this frontier between what you want to collect and what people don't want you to collect.
Yeah, and I think so. I was just talking to a friend of mine backstage who was asking me if I could advise her on whether or not her son ought to evacuate his home, because there's a huge fire that broke out actually early this morning that's now burning west of the 405 and has the potential to put a lot of people out of their homes. And we know that as a state that's sort of on the front lines of climate change, working for a mayor who cares deeply about it, transportation emissions are now top of the list in terms of the sort of causal factors for climate change. So in Los Angeles, we have got to give people different choices for how to get around. So when we had these companies show up overnight with lots and lots of scooters, which is, an exciting new way to get around, we wanted to take a little bit different approach. We wanted to welcome them in because we desperately need people to have choices. But in order for us to be comfortable just opening the doors to probably the largest market for them in the United States, we need information about where these for-profit fleets are operating. So as we're thinking about it, it was really never about the data. It was about how can I, as a regulator, feel comfortable, and how can we reset the scales between tech companies that want to launch in cities and capture market and government that holds the public realm in the public trust. So we have now 37,000 scooters on the streets of Los Angeles, on track for 19 million rides in the first year. And in order to really make sure that those things are going where they should and shouldn't go, I need information. But when we wrote out in very clear way and in open what information we wanted, most of the companies were excited because what it meant was, if we give this information to the city, we can enter this market. But there were a couple of companies that felt like this might be precedent-setting for other parts of their business. And they pushed back really hard. And so now we are in the middle of this, trying to balance how can we give people real choices, hold the data in a way that is anonymous and protects people's privacy in order to enable those choices, just as Rit was pointing out, and at the same time hold the line on the city's right to get this information.
A short question for you. From the perspective of a transportation manager, are scooters more good or more bad?
Yes and no, but mostly no. I would say more good, but for the moment, they're not. They are still going to a lot of the neighborhoods that already are spoiled for choice when it comes to transportation, and we know that because of the data.
One other question on principle before I turn to Ike. You can imagine conceptually two ways to set the frontier in this how to manage privacy and data and information to have more of the good effects and fewer of the bad. One is to limit the collection of it. And anybody who's passed through major airports in the last week or two has seen your sister company Google's campaign of here's how you can collect less data from your Google apps. The other is to collect it and then be very, very careful about how it gets out. Which side of that divide are you on? And if I'm assuming it's the latter side, how do you protect the data?
So we start by collecting as little as possible. And we collect about 6 data points, always just about the vehicle and never about the human on the vehicle. And then we keep it for as short of a period of time as possible. While we have it, it rests in an encrypted state. And we designate it as confidential, meaning it's not subject to PRA requests, and it's also not available to law enforcement absent a legal process.
Thank you. So next we're going to hear from Aik van Eemeren, who's from City of Amsterdam, a wonderful city, and the lead public tech on the CTO Innovation Team for the city there. To me, it's always fascinating to look at Western Europe's approach to these data and privacy issues, because there are sort of 3 great models in the world. There's the Chinese model of all your data belongs to us. There's the US model of whatever the market supports. And there's the European model of trying to say, how can we shape these technology developments in a positive civic way? I'm giving you a softball lead-in, saying that you are thinking your city and your country and your community are trying to think of ways to set this frontier. Tell us what you're doing in this area.
On certain topics, I think we're very clear on this topic. And on the other hand, it's also search. Because when it comes to an example, a mobility question in Amsterdam, there are American companies in Amsterdam. So they have the values of the Amsterdam model. So the approach we seek is, can the people together, the city, the commons, be in charge of the data? So, so I think adding up to your story, not only giving the city access to the data, but giving it to a sort of common place where another vendor can build up on that kind of information, or can you add up? And I think it's important because, well, in Western Europe, people tend to trust the government, and I think it's a good thing. Also because we've got a history of thinking a lot about privacy and privacy by design. So an example, we have a new football match coming up next year, and where you have entertainment during the matches, we tend to fight. So we have a lot of security things around our football matches. So one thing is we're having a huge match in the city center. So traditionally, we would build a wall around it. Now we thought, okay, now can we use digital technology to build a sort of digital wall? It's crossing, it's leaning towards the border of what you think is ethical, right, or etc. So I think the main solution we're seeking is, and I think you're doing the same approach, yes, we want to collect data for security reasons. Yes, we want to be clear about what we collect. So you can see what we collect, you can see what we use. But also knowing that we will probably fail one day or another. So can we also use privacy by design techniques? So knowing that in the end, so when it comes to the China versus European model, we always know that one of you will look at our data, because our state data is stored at Amazon or the Chinese. So in the end, one of you will look at how our city management is going on. Not sure if they pass the data to you. So that third option, it's also vision, but it's not there yet.
So one other follow-up for you. You've written a lot and spoken a lot about the role of algorithms in the way Amsterdam in particular uses its data for public good. Can you say just a word about specifics of what you mean there?
Yeah. Well, I think the main challenge is that I think we're doing some great jobs, but the main challenge is we're definitely not capable of facing that as Amsterdam alone. So together with Barcelona and New York, we built a coalition of cities for digital rights. It's 6 principles regarding these kind of topics. And I think addressing these topics, we should work together. As cities, we need leadership from mayors, from chief technology officers, to say what kind of principles do we want when we use artificial intelligence? What are the terms when we buy it? Who owns the model? Who can contribute to the model? Who can check the model? And I think there's, especially in Europe, we debate a lot about transparency and auditable algorithms. And I think cities play a huge role because when, in example, a matchmaker for a job and people are jobless, they come to us when the model is broken. So we notice first when models are not right, and we should hold someone accountable.
Great, thank you. So, Rit, I have a question for you. You have a background in academics. You have a background in public policy. You're now working for this major tech company. What is the tech possibility in city government you are most excited by, and what is the prospect you're most fearful of?
I can't just do two I'm excited by. Okay. Well, I want to do two I'm excited by because I think they illustrate something that I think is very important about the whole conversation around cities and technology. One is around optimization, right? Knowing more about what's going on in a city allows you to optimize, right? And whether that's travel patterns, or you could use MDS data for traffic signals eventually, or things like that, or some of the algorithms that Amsterdam's been so interested or so ahead of us all on both identifying and then auditing. And that's really exciting, and I do see a ton of promise in, for example, the prospect of an MDS standard, not just for the kinds of things that it's directly intended for, but for the benign additional uses where you could imagine new traffic management systems based on it, or new parking pricing systems based on it, or we're about to do congestion pricing in New York, thank goodness, Mayor Bloomberg proposed it a decade ago. And you think about, we're still going to do a cordon price in 2021, right? It's a 1970s approach to pricing. We should be able to do better. So optimization is one, but the other one, which is less visible, is actually the second or third order use of digital technology, which is to actually increase supply. So I think the biggest idea out of our whole proposal in Toronto is one that seems kind of quaint, which is we want to build all the buildings out of wood. A 35-story building out of wood, right, which takes a carbon source into a carbon sink and we think lowers the price by 30%. It's enabled by the kind of digital technology that would make a factory that could create all the parts for a skyscraper in the same way that automobiles are made from assemblies that all fit together very simply. But if you think about what a 30% reduction in how much it costs to build housing in a dense urban environment means for the biggest problem most of our cities face right now, which is housing affordability, that is a major advance. Now, what am I afraid of? I am afraid of the kind of twin challenges, either of the Pandora's box where the data gets out of our control and we default unwillingly to more of a Chinese model, but the equal problem would be if we put our heads in the sand and decide not to collect it. So you mentioned I'm an academic. I'm a historian by training. We would know so much less about the history of this country, right? And most of us who know anything about our families know it because the Census Bureau collected all of this original data, did not destroy it at the source, right? They kept it under a really good security regime for a long time. And there have been occasional misuses of it, but by and large, that data has been kept sacrosanct. And you think of all the good that that does. There is not an economic decision, there is not a government decision, there is not a business decision in this country that doesn't rely one way or another on census data. What that unlocked is an analogy for what a good set of uses of data could be in the 21st century. And if we decide, oh, this is too dangerous, we don't know how to manage it, then we'll give up on all of that potential.
So, Seleta, your version of this question, you can answer, you can take either fork. One fork is, can Los Angeles get ahead of its transportation problems? That's one answer you can give. Or the other is, which of these prospects are you most actually concerned about in the use of data? You can answer them both if you want.
Great, thanks. Rick got a bonus pro.
I just did like 3.
I feel like, right. Well, I guess that depends on how you would define Los Angeles' transportation problems, right? So last year, we had 250 people die on our streets, the streets that the city manages and operates. We also had one of the #1 reasons for kids in Boyle Heights missing school is childhood asthma, because they are surrounded by 5 freeways, and when your parent can't afford health care and has to take 3 buses to get to an emergency room and loses a day's wages, all of those things are transportation problems. And I believe firmly that if the city can really leap forward and really compete on equal footing, or at least communicate on equal footing with some of the most innovative, private technology and transportation companies in the world, we've got a shot at solving those problems. But if we continue to be siloed and those companies continue to view it as a winner-take-all sort of a prospect, then I'm more pessimistic. And so, we created this organization called the Open Mobility Foundation, which is governed just by public agencies on its board of directors, and then has private technology companies that sit on a tech council and articulate a product roadmap for the future of this stuff together. And so I think if we can see more of that and less sort of litigation and lobbying to keep cities on the sidelines, then I think we've got a shot.
Good. Thank you. So Ike, there are things about the European model that can't be replicated here. We can't have canals like Amsterdam. We can't have a couple of centuries of thinking about sea level already as experience. But from your experience in Amsterdam and Western Europe now, what is the main lesson you would give that would be transferable to some of the mayors and city planners here in North America?
I think there are more similarities than you think. But where you have scooters in your street, one day we woke up and there were 20,000 extra bicycles in our city. So we have similar projects but different vehicles. And also the canals, they weren't made for traffic nowadays. So half of our city, we should find a solution on how to do some traffic management. But the main thing is, and I think that's the approach, well, taking the case of mobility, what we're doing is making it a common problem. So everyone who has a solution or a problem regarding traffic puts their data together, puts their effort together, knowing that data is definitely not the answer at all. Always keeping in mind digital literacy, knowing that a lot of people have no clue about what we're doing with data. I think the best example is if you look at our city data about how people are active in volunteer work, etc., or if you do interviews in the street, you get completely different images. So on one hand, I'm of course the advocacy of using technology and data because that's my job, but always keeping in mind, and I think that's the perfect combination we have together in this room today, using tech for good, making sure that we have some, and I think we discussed earlier, also not being against companies or against the China model, but using the best of both. Start with principles, think about privacy, think of privacy by design technologies. And I think that's the main thing to learn.
Okay, perfect. So there is a microphone. Is there a question from the audience? I think a microphone runner. Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Phil Swan from Greater Manchester in the UK. I wanted to ask about the person's ability to control their own data. So Tim Berners-Lee's taken this mantra on board more recently. In terms of governance in the city, so much of that is about trust. And from the work we've been doing, one of the big factors in trust is people want to be able to see what you're doing with their data. How are you making data transparent to the end user through the work you're doing?
So, you want to lead off on that, and then Seleta?
Well, one of the things that Sidewalk Labs has done, and we've done this as a private company with basically a concept to see whether the world embraces it, is called digital transparency in the public realm. I mean, one of the things that we all know, and of course London is always cited as the most heavily cameraed place in the world, but the reality is all of our cities are heavily surveilled already, right? And what does not happen, though, is any sort of standardized disclosure for who's collecting that data, what information is being collected, where is it going and what it's being used for, and where you could find more information about it. And so we did a project, in fact, we did a workshop in London, I think we did one on the West Coast as well, a couple of others, to come up with a concept for a set of symbols that would be a bit like all the symbols that we intuitively now recognize to guide road traffic, right? To alert people to, well, here's what's going on here. Because the reality is when something's happening in the public realm, you don't really have the ability to opt out in a meaningful way. But at the very least, we think it ought to be crystal clear and easy to understand what's going on and give you the ability to find out more.
So, Ike, final word to you. You look like you wanted to have the final word.
Adding the European approach, we just finished a 3-year research project with the European Commission. It's called Decode. And we build also technical, but also policy and judicial solution on can we give people control over their own data. And it's, I think, interesting to look because it's a copy-paste solution. Data not owned by us, not owned by you, but giving people control over their own data. I think it's interesting to check it out.
So we're beginning a conversation that will go on for months and years. Please join me now in thanking our excellent panel.